Good morning, everyone. It's Rabbi Akiva Males. Today is Friday. It is November 20th. We're getting ready for Parshas Toldos. I want to share a short Devar Torah with you. I saw something this week which was absolutely beautiful. In Perek Chaf Hey, chapter 25 this week in Parshas Toldos, we read that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem appears to Yitzchak, and he wants to let Yitzchak know why was it that he loved his father. He loved Avraham Avinu so much. And the pasuk tells us, "Ekev asher shama Avraham b'koli." I loved Avraham, and I made him such great promises, and they're going to fulfill themselves in you and your progeny. Why? Because Avraham always listened to my voice, to everything I asked of him. V'yishmor mishmarti. He kept my charges, mitzvosai, all of my commandments, chukosai, all my statutes, v'torasai, and all my instructions. That's why I loved Avraham Avinu. Everything I asked of him, he fulfilled. No questions whatsoever. And the Mefarshim all go on to explain what are these different ideas, what falls under the classification of Mishmarti, Mitzvosai, Chukosai, V'torasai. And the Ramban, Nachmanides here, he has a very long piece on this. And at the end of his piece, he says, but let's go back to Pashut Pshat. The Ramban says, Al derech HaPshat, what are these classifications in the simplest understanding? And he says, what's Mishmarti? That he says Avraham kept all of my charges, is that he informed the world about me. He taught the world about monotheism. He tried to eradicate Avodah Zarah, idol worship, and polytheism. He tried to get away with all that and try to introduce this idea to everyone who would listen, that there was a creator, there was a Barei Olam, and it was only one, and only that creator that was worth worshiping. That's Mishmarti. Mitzvosai, what falls under that classification? He says he fulfilled everything I asked of him. In Parshas Lech Lecha, I said, leave your homeland, leave your parents, leave your family, all that, and he did that. I also asked him in Parshas Vayera to bring Yitzchak up as a bound offering, and he was ready to do that. He went through all the motions until it was finally time to actually slaughter him, and I told him stop, and he stopped. And then also when it came time to saying that you had to chase away Hagar and Yishmael, that was a great challenge for Avraham. But nonetheless, when I let him know it was the right thing to do, he followed through with the two. That's mitzvosai. What's chukosai? So he says, chukosai, let me read to you in the Hebrew. Chukosai is laleches b'darchei Hashem, that he emulated me. Liyos chanun v'rachum, that just like Hashem is kind of plenty full of mercy and compassion, Avraham Avinu was also full of mercy, compassion, and kindness. Voset tzedakah mishpat, and he did all sorts of righteousness. He was engaged in acts of tzedakah and mishpat and justice. And he also instructed his children, his whole household, to carry through on these actions as well. And finally, what's Torah Sai? What does it mean that Avraham Avinu kept my instructions? So he says that's going about Milah, the Bris Milah that I asked him to do. That was a challenge for him and his household, all of his descendants. He was faithful to that as well. But the Ramban classified under the word Chukosai all these acts of chesed and tzedakah, the kindness and charitable works that Avraham was involved in, that falls under the category of chukosai. Beautiful idea from the Ramban. He says that's Pashut Pshat. I saw an incredible insight from Rav Shimon Schwab Zatzal this week. Rav Schwab asked such an obvious question on this Ramban. Throughout Kol Torah Kula, in all of our rabbinic writings as well, whenever we see the concept of chukim, statues involved, what are chukim? Statutes. Those aren't mitzvahs that we understand or that would come to us naturally. Chukim are those mitzvahs, those instructions we've received by Hashem that we never would have come up with on our own. Shatnez, refraining from wearing clothing that have a mixture of wool and linen. That's a chok. The idea that we're not allowed to shave with a razor. Why not? So he says that's a chok. We got to use a scissor-like device or something, or a cream, something of that device. That's a chok. We don't know why. I never would have come up with that on my own. Many of the laws of kashrus, I can only eat fish that have fins and scales. Why can't I eat a catfish? Who says? What's the reason? I wouldn't have come up with that on my own. That's a chok. That for animals, they have to have cloven hooves and chew their cud. Why? That's a chok. Those are statues. Throughout the Torah and throughout all of our Sifrei Chazal, chukim are always used to describe those mitzvahs that we never would have had the intuition to come up with on our own. And here the Ramban says, when Hashem says, why did I love Avram? Because he kept all of these things. One of them was chukim. What are the chukosai? It's talking about tzedakah and chesed. But that's not something that's a chok. Tzedakah and chesed, everybody understands that's important. Everyone understands for a world to operate as we would like it to, we need tzedakah, we need charity, we need chesed, we need kindness. Why on earth would the Ramban classify tzedakah and chesed under the umbrella of chukosai? as my statutes. I never would have done that. Great question, Rav Schwab asked. And here's what Rav Schwab answers. Rav Schwab says as follows. He says, yes, there are aspects of tzedakah and chesed that are plenty, that a person could have come up with on their own. They're intuitive. What are they? Yeah, when someone looks like me, when someone's nice to me, when someone's part of my group, when someone's part of my crowd, when someone looks the way I would want, like the person I would want to be associated with, that's when I'm naturally drawn to be involved with chesed, kindness, and tzedakah and charity. But there's a lot of other people in this world. There are people in this world that are not part of my circle. There are people in this world who might be quite offensive and repulsive, but they're also human beings. They're created b'tselem Elokim. And we know that Hashem is Rachamav al kol ma'asav. Hashem is Rachamim. Hashem has mercy and compassion on all of his creations. Avram Avinu, here the Ramban says, that he was following Hashem leleches b'drachai, that he was emulating me in my acts of tzedakah and chesed. What are those acts? They're not limited to those who just appear to me to be deserving of my chesed, my tzedakah, but rather al kol ma'asav, to all of my creations. That's the type of Baal Chesed and Baal Tzedakah that Avraham was. And then for that, it did fit under Chok. Because a person on their own would not come up with this idea to share kindness and share tzedakah and charity with those type of people. I naturally would want to share tzedakah and chesed with those who fit my description of those who are worthy recipients of those. People who look like me, they're part of my crowd. But people who may be off, they may be a little bit different, they may be somewhat repulsive, to them I want to share tzedakah and chesed. I wouldn't have come up with that on my own. But Avram did. Why? Because he saw tzedakah and chesed as a chok. Even if I don't logically understand it, why I should be sharing with that person? Nonetheless, Hashem shares. Hashem is a rachamav al kol ma'asav, has compassion and mercy on everybody, and therefore that's what he expects of us as well. And in that respect, Avraham was an absolute genius. Because yes, there must have been other people who were involved in tzedakah and chesed, but only amongst those that they liked, and only amongst those that fit their criteria of those who were deserving. Avram was the one who stepped outside that box and was willing to share kindness, generosity, charity, compassion with all human beings, not just those who looked like him and were part of his family and may have been up to the task of being the most respected members of the community. That's such a beautiful idea, and it reminds us what Hashem expects of us if we truly want to be emulating God in acts of tzedakah and chesed. And this really should resonate with all of us, because I'm sure we're all familiar with this teaching. Twice in the Torah, the Parsha lists for us the kosher, which birds are not kosher. It does it in Parsha Shmini in Sefer Vayikra, and again in Parshas Re'eh in Sefer Devarim. And in Shmini, when it tells us about the birds that are not kosher, and again in Re'eh, it tells us one of the birds is called the Chasida. The Chasida. So you'll find it in Shmini. It's in Vayikra in Perek Yud Aleph, chapter 11. The Chasida is listed in Pasuk Yud Gimel. Yud Tes 19. And the Pasuk says Chasida. Rashi over there quotes the Gemara in Chulin, and it says, what type of bird is Chasida? Zudaya Levana. It's the white daya. Some say it's the stork. It's the white stork. V'lama nikra shma Chasida. Why was it called a Chasida? She'osa Chasidus im chavruseha b'mizonos. Because it shares chesed with all of its fellow kin, with all of its like-minded individuals. It shares chesed by sharing its food with them. That's why this bird was named the Chasida. So there's an obvious question here that many ask. That seems like an honorable trait. It's called the Chasida because it's a chassid. It's saintly. It shares. It does such chesed with its fellow birds. So what's the problem? The Ramban Nachmanides was of the opinion that said that the reason why all these birds weren't kosher is because there's some kind of bad midos. There's some kind of bad characteristics about these birds. What's bad about this? It's a chasida. It's sharing. It's filled with chesed. So there's a famous answer that's out there. I've seen it attributed to numerous sources. I've seen some attributed to the first Ger Rebbe, the Chidushei Arim, and I see in the Art Scroll Chumash they attribute it to the Rizhnitzer Rebbe. And they said you have to look carefully at that quote of Rashi, where he's quoting the Gemara in Chulin, that it shares chesed, she'osa chesed im chavroseha, only with its friends, only with its like-minded individuals, only with its fellow storks. That's who it shares. That's who it shares its act of kindness with. But it will not go outside that circle, not willing to step outside that circle and to share chesed with others. That's a terrible trait. And Hashem wants us to stay away from that trait. That's why the stork that Hasidah is meant to teach us, it's off limits. We have to go beyond that, and we have to be like Avraham Avinu. We have to view tzedakah and chesed as a chok and share it with, even with those that I wouldn't have thought that they're deserving of my tzedakah and chesed. I want to conclude with a great story that I read. I saw a story I quoted, and I looked it up this week, from Reb Pesach Kron's first book. In his book, The Maggid Speaks. I don't know if that was his first book. It's from his original series, his Maggid series. It was called The Maggid Speaks. It may have been his first or second. And in that book, it's on page 216. He brings down an incredible story. Rav Shlomo Shwadron, who was, Rav Shalom Shwadron, who was that famous Maggid of Yerushalayim that so many of his early books were based on, the stories that Rav Shalom would tell over. So Rav Shalom Shwadron would always tell over the story about Merka. Who is Merka? Merka, and why did Merka make it into a story? Story went as follows. Rav Shalom Shwadron was once in his apartment in his home in Yerushalayim, and he was learning one day. And all of a sudden, from outside in the street, in the alley in front of the house, they hear a terrible child's shriek, screaming. So his Rebbetzin Shwadron runs outside to see what's happening, and he sees that there's a little boy from the neighborhood, Meir, that everyone calls Meirka as a nickname. So she sees Meirka must have fallen. He was playing with some friends. He must have been on top of a wall, and he fell, and he hit his head, and he's bleeding profusely from his head. So she runs and scoops him up. She comes out with a wet towel. She's holding it onto the cut. And she tells her husband, come, we need to rush him to a doctor because there was no adults around. So Rav Shalom scoops up this little America, and he's running down the street. And his wife, his Rebbetzin, is holding this cold compress, this cold towel, a wet towel on his head to staunch the bleeding, and the kid is screaming. And all of a sudden, they start to hear someone up the street. There's a beautiful, kind, gentle woman up the street. And she sees what's going on, that Rav Shwadron and his Rebbetzin are running, and this little child is screaming. She's holding something to his head. So she wants to calm them down. And she screams out, Rav Shalom, Rav Shalom. She says in Yiddish, but I'll translate it, there's nothing to be worried about. Hashem will surely help. Don't worry. Don't be in such a panic, you and your Rebbetzin. It'll all be good. Hashem will help. Let me read to you this next paragraph. I wondered, said Rav Shalom, whether her reaction would change when she realized who the child really was. This child was actually that woman's grandson. Will she still be calm then? As the lady came a bit closer, she began to suspect that maybe the child was not one of the Shwadron children, and so her reassurances that nothing was seriously wrong and that Hashem would surely help became a bit muted. Now the woman herself began rushing to see just who the child was, and as the Shwadrons passed directly in front of her, she looked down and realized that the bleeding child was none other than her own grandson. In a flash, she lost herself completely and began shrieking uncontrollably, Gewalt, America, America, Gewalt, as she struggled to take hold of the child. So Rav Shalom was transformed by this story, and he would always tell it over and talk about this America. And he would say, when it's not my America, it's easy to say, don't worry, nothing's wrong, Hashem's going to help. But when it's my America, then it's a whole different story. And that's human reaction. When it's closer to home, we get engaged and we get all actively involved in tzedakah and chesed. But once it's a little bit further away, whether it's out of my comfort zone, it's out of my circle of friends, whether it's someone who doesn't look like me, doesn't talk like me, is someone that I just don't think is a prime example of what Hashem wants from another Jew, whatever it may be, I'm less likely to get engaged with chesed and with tzedakah. And the lesson of Avraham Avinu is that, no, we have to view these as a chok, that we have to be involved, even if it doesn't make sense that I should share kindness, generosity with such a person. Hashem is rachamav al kol ma'asav. Hashem shows compassion to all of his creations. That's what we need to do as well. And that's our lesson from the stork, the Hasidah. We got to distance ourselves from that mentality of only sharing chesed and kindness with those who look and think exactly and act and behave exactly like us. No, Hashem is rachamav al kol ma'asav. That's the way we have to be as well. And that's how the Ramban learns in this week's Parsha. That's why Hashem says he loved Abraham, because he kept my chukosai. And what's under that classification? Tzedakah and chesed. Because he viewed tzedakah and chesed as a chok. He shared them even with those who instinctively he may not have been inclined to do so. But he did so because he wanted to emulate Hashem. And that's what we need to emulate as well. Have a good Shabbos, everyone.